Very warm welcome to St Michael and Angels today, and especially to our guest at the Chiswick Book Festival, Loyd Grossman, whom I had previously known as a television presenter on Through the Keyhole and MasterChef, also as a pasta sauce magnate, and even as a cultural campaigner, a former Commissioner of English Heritage and the Royal Commission on the Historical Monuments of England, and many other committees in that field. So I might have guessed that his interest is in art history, and indeed he first trained as an historian, studying both in the States and here in London at the LSE and in Cambridge. I didn't guess, though, that he is a rock guitarist, and from the book he has written An Elephant in Rome, Bernini, the Pope, and the Making of the Eternal City, a lover not just of rock, but the Baroque. Loyd Grossman, welcome. Tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book about Bernini, the Pope, and Rome.
Well, it was just really satisfying my own curiosity, because I've been a long-time lover of Rome. But I never actually understood the place, because, of course, it's a hugely complicated city, having been one of the centers of Western civilization for a couple of thousand years. And in an effort to get to grips with Rome, I wanted to find out what was happening in Rome in the 17th century. And that led me on quite a long research project, which culminated in this book. So really, you know, it was to explain to myself why Rome looks the way it looks.
You begin by talking about the elephant with an obelisk on its back outside the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, which every cardinal, as you know, has a titular church in Rome, and someone, the late Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, who retired and lived in Chiswick, that was his titular church. So I'm glad there's a kind of Chiswick connection. And of course it's very near to where I go very often, what we call the tat merchants, Gamarelli and the Pantheon. Gamarelli is the Pope's tailor, so somewhere I know very well.
And Gamarelli have the most incredible selection of socks, because you can go in there and buy bishop socks, you can buy cardinal socks, you can even buy papal socks in Gamarelli. It's such a great shop.
You're not wearing any today, though.
No, I'm sockless today, which some people could say was even more Italian.
But the elephant with the obelisk intrigued you, and that set you on a journey looking not just at Rome, but Bernini in particular. And it seems to me your book is not just the story of one particular sculpture, but, as you're saying, the making of a city. Both are entwined. What did you find on your journey looking at both?
Oh gosh, well, it's a very interesting time to be writing about cities, because, you know, for the first time in history, half the population of the world are city dwellers. Yet, because of the pandemic, everyone is questioning whether the city has any future at all. And thinking about a city like Rome, which very consciously tried to reinvent itself, and I think succeeded at the time in reinventing itself as the must-see destination, one began to wrestle with all sorts of questions about the value of cities. You know, why do we have cities? What do cities do for us? Too many people now are becoming very anti-city, and you know, there is a sort of prevailing myth that everyone is going to move out to the country, no one's going to go back to the office, etc. But you know, without cities, we will not have museums, we will not have theaters, we will not have the opera. All of our great cultural institutions are supported by this fantastic invention called the city. And coincidentally, when I was investigating Rome, I came across all sorts of questions and some answers about why cities are important. The 17th century, to me, is especially interesting because it's far enough back in time to be really weird and really peculiar and really intriguing, yet it's also kind of recognizably modern. So one can empathize with the people of the 17th century, yet also really need to find out what they were thinking about, what their ethos was, what their world was like. And that drew me to 17th century Rome in particular. At the time, the greatest city in the world. Not the biggest, not the most commercially important, not the most modern in some ways, but the most important city in the world.
And I suppose before the 17th century it was rather dilapidated.
Oh, it was pretty run down. The population of ancient Rome is generally regarded to be about 1 million-ish. By the 17th century, it was less than 200,000. Great areas of the city were depopulated. The whole place was pretty dilapidated, and it was a huge challenge to the popes in the 16th and the 17th century to recreate Rome. Of course, there was a huge political agenda because following the early success of the Reformation, the Catholic Church was on the back foot. What were they going to do to reassert themselves?
And so the Counter-Reformation is launched, and that had impact not only in defining church teaching, but on the arts as well. And along comes a particular pope you've got an interest in, Alexander VII. Tell us a bit about what he did to transform this rather dilapidated city.
Well, Alexander VII was very much a product of the Counter-Reformation because, of course, as you know, in an effort to launch the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church convened the Council of Trent, which met for years and years and years.
Nearly 20 years. Yeah.
Nearly 20 years, figuring out how to reassert the primacy of the Catholic Church. And one of the things they came up with, very consciously, was the use of art and architecture and music, all the good things in life, other than food and wine. I'm sure they came in there somewhere. But, to use the arts as a way of drawing people back into the body of the church. So, and this is particularly interesting, because at the moment, faced with the great challenges that society has, a lot of people are saying, well, the arts, do we really need them? We've got to, every available cent has to be poured into the NHS, into social care, into the economy, forgetting the fact that the arts give a sort of meaning to life without which everything else is rather pointless. So the primacy of the arts in terms of papal and Catholic Church thinking in the late 16th and 17th century is really significant and something we should bear in mind. Alexander VII was an extraordinarily talented man. He came from one of these grand but impoverished families, the Keyhole family. One of his collateral ancestors had been the papal banker to Julius II and had become hugely rich as a result of that. Because one has to remember that the papacy was a business as well as a spiritual calling at that period. So Fabio Keyhole was incredibly erudite. He worked as a papal diplomat. He was a very talented Latinist. He liked surrounding himself with poets and artists and so on. And when he became Pope, his mission, in many ways, was to reassert the primacy of Rome as the must-see, must-go-to leading cultural destination in Europe. And this was his way of making up for the political, diplomatic, economic deficit which Rome was struggling under. So he said, and military. So he said, yeah, you know something? We're losing political power, but there's this thing, and you know, he obviously didn't call it that. We now call it soft power. He said, look, culture has power. Culture has power. And in order to exercise that cultural power, he decided to make Rome the most splendid city in Europe.
And he used one of the greatest artists of the time.
Yeah.
Perhaps the greatest artist.
Bernini. And Bernini is so fascinating, Kevin, because he's not really terribly well known in the English-speaking world. Yet, if you think about the 17th century, which was the period of Rubens, Rembrandt, Vermeer, Velázquez, all those giants who are household names, Bernini was much more famous than all of them. He was the greatest artist in 17th century Europe, and fortunately, Pope Alexander VII had him as his number one henchman, and it was the perfect match.
You describe it as one of the greatest artistic double acts in history.
Yeah, because artists, you know, in the days before there was a market for art, artists needed patrons. If you didn't have a patron, you couldn't really be an artist. And the greatest patron of all was the Pope. Pope was the greatest patron, and he fixed on Bernini. There were a lot of other talented people around, Borromini, for example. But the Pope was a great friend of Bernini, and he knew that Bernini could deliver. And that's quite important.
Yeah. Let's explore Bernini a bit. I mean, some wonderful photographs in your book, beginning when he was 12. It's quite extraordinary that he could produce such a brilliant piece of sculpture with sort of psychological insight, a real portrait, and he's a kid.
Yeah, he was Mozart. He was Mozart. He was a child prodigy. His father was a very good but not very brilliant sculptor. So he grew up in the sculptor's workshop, you know, with the marble dust and the chisel and all of that stuff. And by the time he was 12, his talents had, you know, far eclipsed his father's. And of course, in that period, when art was part of the papal propaganda machine, when art was a very important way of conveying ideas, he was snapped up by the Roman establishment. He came to the attention of the most important people in Rome when he was barely a teenager, and he never looked back. He lived to be, you know, 82, and his entire life was, you know, with just a couple of tiny bumps in the road. His entire life was spent in the employ of the most powerful and richest patrons in Italy. And he got to beautify Rome. He almost worked exclusively at Rome. He got to beautify Rome. And aren't we the lucky ones who still get to appreciate?
Well, one of the things your book made me want to do is go to Rome and follow the Bernini trail, because it goes sort of all around Rome, doesn't it? One way or the other. Small little portraits or busts to grand architectural sort of things.
I mean, someone asked me, one of the newspapers asked me to write a sort of Bernini trail around Rome, and I said, it's almost impossible not to do a Bernini trail of Rome, because everywhere you look in Rome, there is some fantastic bit of Bernini. And with the exception, I suppose, of someone like Haussmann, who transformed Paris in the 19th century, I don't think there is a single artist in the world who had a greater influence on a city than Bernini did. So, in a microcosmic way, you have Norman Shaw in Bedford Park, and in a slightly bigger way, you have Bernini doing the same thing in Rome.
Yes. I mean, we must celebrate Bernini as an artist, one of the great artists of all time. A likable man, though?
It's very hard to say. I think that a lot of successful artists, a lot of very successful artists, are egotistical, selfish, very money-orientated. I mean, it's not surprising because it's a tough world out there, and it was especially a tough world in the 17th century. And to be an artist and to get ahead, you had to have the most enormous amount of self-belief.
Modesty is not a characteristic.
No, modesty, forget. Modesty has never made a great artist. and I think, one of the, what I call the dirty secrets of art history, in art history, we're always taught about the aesthetics. The sort of analysis of the work of art, why is it beautiful, what did he or she do, etc., etc. But what's really going on below the surface of art history? Artists have got to make a living, they want to be successful, etc., etc. I remember someone said, I think it might have been John Richardson when he was interviewing Picasso, said, gee, it must have been so exciting. You and Matisse spent so much time together. What did you talk about? And Picasso said, we talked about the price of paint. And, to artists, and artists like Bernini, what was really important, aside from, expressing his creative vision, things like the price of marble was important, the price of getting a big enough studio to work in, all of that sort of stuff.
Getting the next commission.
Getting the next commission. So it's not surprising that someone with Bernini's extraordinary success would have had a very high opinion of himself, would not have suffered fools gladly, was not really a very tolerant person or very helpful to other artists. But look what we get in the end.
I was reading the book. Interestingly, you were talking about the pandemic, because that's part of the background now of reading your book, but also the celebration of Beethoven, 250 years. And here's someone else who had to find patronage but didn't much like it, didn't want to glorify the patron but did want to glorify music or God or whatever. A difficult man, but the same with Bernini, that sort of the endless energy of a genius, working all the time, the need just to express themselves through their art. Do you see any kind of comparison?
Yes, I think that is a common feature of many geniuses in every art form. I mean, we know, for example, how difficult, in many ways, how juvenile, how selfish someone like Mozart was, yet he creates the most sublime music. We look at Bernini, who was probably not a barrel of laughs to be married to, and probably not a great one for cozy evenings around the fireside, yet, for all his failings, he produced works of art that speak to human values, which we all share.
One of the works that you celebrate is his David. I mean, the most famous David is Michelangelo's David in Florence, but you say your opinion is this is a much greater depiction of David.
Yeah, I mean...
Needs to be known.
Yeah, I mean, look, who can criticize Michelangelo? But when you look at his David, the famous David in Florence, it's very kind of static, and it's very, very beautiful, but it's a little bit effete, it's very static,
And naked, of course. You couldn't get away with that in the Counter-Reformation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Counter-Reformation, you had to have a bit of kit on. But Berninis David is so extraordinary and sort of says everything about the Baroque, because Berninis David is captured just at the moment when he's about to fling the stone at Goliath. So you have this extraordinary physical energy, this great dynamism. And when you look at David's face, which, by the way, is a self-portrait of Bernini, because Bernini posed himself for that sculpture, David's face is so full of determination. You can see that this is someone in his 20s who was determined to conquer the world. And that's what Bernini did. He conquered the artistic world of 17th century Europe. And it's all summed up, I think, in that one wonderful, wonderful work of art.
It was an interesting time, wasn't it, in that Christina of Sweden had abdicated, became a Catholic and lived in Rome. Extraordinary, eccentric character. And he also did lots of things for her, didn't he? Looking glasses and I think a carriage, or was it a sedan chair?
Yeah, he was Christina of Sweden. I mean, gosh, I think, isn't there an old film about her which starred Greta Garbo, I think? And Christina was a very odd character. She was kind of regarded by her contemporaries as being rather androgynous. She didn't conform to what was the female ideal of the time, the queenly idea of the time. Her father, Gustav Adolphus, was, of course, the great Protestant hero of the 30 Years' War. So to have a daughter who converted to Catholicism was like the greatest war trophy the papacy could have. So when she came to Rome, they pulled out all the stops to welcome her. She was a very difficult house guest. I mean, she was really a rather sort of painful individual, was a bane to a succession of popes. But Bernini was very, very close to her, very close to her. And as you say, he did a lot of personal stuff for her, a looking glass, a carriage, etc., etc. And when he died, he left her one of his most personal sculptures, which is a beautiful, fantastic, very late Bernini bust of Christ. And that was his personal gift to her. She was one of the many sort of bigwigs that Bernini actually seemed to have had a real friendship with. And that's quite impressive, because in spite of his egotism, he obviously had, and I should say his obsequiousness, because he was a courtier, he obviously had a gift for friendship. And that's quite important.
There's a sensational story you tell about another woman in his life, Costanza.
Yeah, that wasn't so good. When he was in his 30s, he fell madly in love with Costanza, which was great, you know. Isn't that nice? Except she was married to one of his chief assistants, and she was also having an affair with Bernini's brother. So she was quite busy, and Bernini was so in love with her that he carved a life-size marble bust of her, which is a really important moment in the history of art, because up until then, you know, a marble bust is very expensive and very prestigious. And until that stage, a life-size marble bust would only be carved of a queen, a duchess, a goddess, a mythological heroine. Suddenly, to have an ordinary woman, a girlfriend, the subject of the grandest possible form of portraiture is absolutely revolutionary. And it is a testament, an extraordinary testament, to the great love that Bernini felt for her. Sadly, in a typical 17th century Italian way, of course, when it was, when the extent of her two-timing, three-timing was revealed, it was all right for the boys. She was the one who was punished. So Bernini hired a thug to go up to her and slash her face with a razor because she'd had an affair with his brother. She was sent to a house for fallen women. Bernini's brother was exiled for a few months, and Bernini was told, why don't you get married? And he suddenly married a very respectable woman. So the love affair is a testament to Bernini's humanity, I suppose, but it shows him not in a very good light, not in a very generous light.
We better go back to his sculpture then. What do you think he added that was innovative to sculpture? What makes it alive? What makes it great as far as you're concerned?
What he did was, firstly, he had incredible technical skill. And he could make marble, which is a very difficult material. If you just think about what is marble, marble is really cold and really hard and really beautiful, but it's really cold and it's really hard. And Bernini, through his extraordinary imagination and his technical ability, could make marble seem as warm and as soft as flesh. He could take this unyielding material and make it vivacious, create a sense of movement. So his technical skill was quite astonishing. And added to that, he had a brilliant conception of design. He could come up with new ways of telling old stories. His sculpture of Daniel in the lion's den is absolutely extraordinary. In terms of the empathy it evokes with Daniel. He had an incredible imagination, really astonishing imagination. He also, as a man manager, as a person manager, he didn't do everything himself. He turned out an enormous amount of stuff. Every great artist in those days, whether it was Rubens, they all had people who painted the fabric or the dogs or the background. So Bernini employed almost every important sculptor in 17th century Rome, but very much under his direction, with his vision, with his standards. And he transformed the art of sculpture and made it so vivacious and engaging, something that had never been done before, even by the greatest sculptors like Donatello or Michelangelo. Bernini gave it a new life force, and that's an incredible achievement.
One of the great innovations being the baldacchino in St. Peter's, which is architecture, it's sculpture, looks like a building.
Yeah, I mean, what is
it?
What is it? That's an incredible thing, because the baldacchino, I mean, in terms of its role in the Catholic Church, it's an incredibly important work of art, because it is the canopy that is sheltering the tomb of St. Peter. So it is, very few things are more important than that. And he builds this colossal structure. I mean, it's 30 meters high, 30 meters worth of bronze. He didn't really know anything about bronze before he started doing that. And he creates something which, is it a building? Is it a work of sculpture? Is it a bit of decorative knick-knackery? What is it? But anyone, I mean, I defy anyone to go into St. Peter's and look at the baldacchino and not be spiritually moved. That's one of the things to me that's very exciting about Bernini's work.
Because it doesn't get lost in that massive space. It makes a huge statement.
It makes a huge statement. And ditto, the same thing with the work that he did in St. Peter's Square. I mean, gosh, you don't have to be Catholic to stand in St. Peter's Square and think, gee, this is really important. Something, there is something really amazing happening around me. And, to me, that is one of the great things that Bernini brought to art and to town planning and to architecture, is the ability to move people emotionally and spiritually and inspirationally. And it's something that we very much need at the moment.
I thought, I like the way you bust some of the myths I've been living with. And one of them was that the bronze had all come from the Pantheon. That's not true at all, is it?
No, I mean, the bronze...
You've done the research and you know this.
Yeah, well, I know it to the extent that anyone knows it, but a lot of the... there was a very casual attitude towards what we would now call historic preservation in the 17th century. So the bronze was stripped from the portico of the Pantheon, supposedly to be melted down and used for the baldacchino. Most of it ended up being turned into cannons for the papal fortress. So there are a lot of very sort of interesting myths around things like what happens to bronze, because bronze was very valuable and it was quite hard to get hold of. I think that myth busting is not something that I particularly set out to do, but I think sometimes when you bust the myths, you find a more interesting truth.
Absolutely.
Because I love myth. I think myth is hugely important. Myth is very moving. But sometimes the truth is actually more interesting.
Tell me a bit about Bernini's attitude to the built environment. What was he trying to do in squares? We'll come back to St. Peter's, but did he do something outside the Pantheon to make that more of a welcoming space?
Well, Alexander VII was very keen to improve the surroundings of the Pantheon. The Pantheon, to me, and I guess to many other people, is kind of the most extraordinary building in the world. And in many ways, I envy people who have not yet seen it, because the excitement of seeing it and walking inside it is hard to express. Even in the 17th century, the Pantheon was regarded as the most important building in the world. So Alexander VII was very keen to improve the setting of the Pantheon, which had become very crowded and full of sort of shacks selling the equivalent of I Love Rome T-shirts. So Alexander VII got rid of all that. He employed Bernini to sort of slightly smarten up the Pantheon without doing too much. But what Bernini had a sense of was a sense of the theater. He was a very keen amateur playwright.
Yes.
Very keen amateur playwright. And one of the things that emerges in all his work to me, and is so important about Rome, and was very much the way in which Rome was discussed by his contemporaries, is the sense of the city as a theater. And Rome was often explicitly described as a theater, the theater of the world. And that, to me, is kind of a great concept, because it implies that one of the roles of architecture is to make everyday life dramatic and exciting. And Bernini, through his town planning, through his vision of town planning, through his creation of outdoor spaces and indoor spaces, always wanted to dial up the drama. And that's something that everyone could benefit from. It wasn't just for the toffs and the prelates, it was for everyone. That, to me, is one of his great contributions to architecture.
And where outside space has become so important to us, isn't it?
It's become...
And how we identify with it and how it embraces us, as well as how we embrace it. Yeah.
It's become especially important, as we noticed during the whole lockdown period. And London in particular, and other great cities of the world, too often space has become privatized and space has become monetarized. And it's really important to reassert the value of the public realm, public space, because there aren't that many places where everyone can feel like an equal citizen, an equal participant. And this rediscovery of the value of the public realm, I hope, is something that has come out of this whole difficult time that we're going through at the moment.
And the space outside of St. Peter's he transformed. I think somewhere you call it the embracing arms of the church, the colonnades that come out. And that again is very theatrical, very dramatic as you come through into that space, through the colonnades and see St. Peter's. It's amazing.
It's an incredible bit of stagecraft. And you know, I think it's really exciting to introduce this element of the theatrical.
With enormous statues on top.
Huge statues. I mean,
everything is.
The practicality. I forget the number. I mean, I should remember. There are something like, I don't know, 195 or 210 statues of saints topping the great colonnades of St. Peter's. And what's very interesting, of course, you know, and this goes back to the real business of being an artist, is they're not carved out of marble. They're carved out of travertine, which is a cheaper, softer, easier to manipulate stone, and quicker to get it finished, because all these projects took years and years and years. And Bernini was getting to be quite mature at that stage, and he wanted to get it done. And of course, the papacy, which was running out of money, had to pay for this thing. So there was an interest in doing things, I won't say cheaply, but I will say efficiently.
There was a political shift, wasn't there, when Louis XIV in France demands Bernini to come to him and to create works for him. Tell us that story.
Well, it's kind of a funny idea to realize just how politically significant artists were in the 17th century. I mean, you couldn't imagine sort of Donald Trump ringing up Boris Johnson and saying, I must have Damien Hirst or Tracy Emin's sent to Washington. You know, it doesn't quite work that way these days. But because Bernini was such a sort of prestigious artist, because he was so brilliant at the visual propaganda, at making a statement, a grandeur, Louis XIV, who was the rising monarch of the time, and, you know, was pretty aggressive and, you know, knew what he wanted. I mean, he was a bully. Louis XIV literally said to the Pope, I want Bernini. And the Pope said, well, you know, he's kind of busy. And Louis XIV said, no, I'm sorry, I don't think you heard me. I want Bernini. And eventually the Pope had to cave in and sent Bernini to Paris because Louis XIV wanted him to design a new extension to the Louvre Palace. It was a total disaster. It was the biggest failure of Bernini's career. He didn't like the French. He was very snotty towards them, told them they didn't have any taste, they didn't know anything.
No talent.
You know, he was just all over them. And unsurprisingly, they weren't that impressed. And so he was sent home. It was the only failure of his career, but the fact that he even got to Paris and had all these personal audiences with Louis XIV is a sort of great testimony to how important art was, because, you know, before television, before advertising, you know, if you wanted to make a statement about yourself as a monarch, your prestige as a sovereign, you employed great artists to do that. Louis XIV was particularly obsessed with promoting his image, and he thought, well, I must have the greatest image maker in Europe. It just didn't work out.
And Bernini wasn't there for long.
No, he was there, I think it was about 5 months.
Did he regard it himself as a failure?
No. I think he regarded France as a failure.
He was fine. Everyone else let him down.
Bernini, he's such an extraordinary character to deal with because he had not one scintilla of self-doubt. It was always the other person's problem, and I think he probably felt that France had been a waste of time because the French weren't clever enough to appreciate what a genius he was.
So back to Rome. Let's talk about obelisks, which is a word I love to say. Obelisks. Rome has got more standing obelisks than anywhere else in the world.
Yeah. Rome has 13 obelisks, more than in Egypt. The first obelisk was brought back to Rome in 30 BC by Octavian, who became the Emperor Augustus, as a souvenir. Not quite. Not quite a shaken snow paperweight, but the same sort of thing, as a souvenir to commemorate his conquest of Egypt. Conquering Egypt was a very big deal for the Romans because Egypt was the great source of grain for Rome. And also, of course, even 2,000 years ago, Egypt was an ancient civilization. I mean, it predated Rome by 3,000 or 4,000 years. So for the Romans to supersede what had been the greatest civilization in history was something that was worth commemorating. So Augustus began this tradition of bringing obelisks back to Rome and re-erecting them in Rome. And Rome got all these wonderful obelisks. With the fall of the Roman Empire, the obelisks were not very well looked after. A lot of them collapsed and broke and were lost and so on. And it was really chiefly in the Renaissance that the Romans began to rediscover the value of Egyptian artifacts and began to excavate these obelisks and reuse them. And it was the slightly comically named Pope Sixtus V. I love it. It's just so great, Sixtus V. Sixtus V decided that, who had a great vision of town planning, decided that he would take the obelisks and plant them in front of the major pilgrimage churches in Rome as sort of signposts. And so he began this tradition of taking great public spaces and sticking an obelisk in the middle of them and using that as a way to signal the great landmarks of Rome, the great basilicas. This tradition continued, and Bernini was not immune from it. When a relatively small obelisk was discovered in the monastery of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, Bernini used it to create a monument for his friend Pope Alexander VII, and he very innovatively used it by sticking it on the back of an elephant. He had an elephant holding up an obelisk.
This is the elephant in Rome.
This is the elephant in Rome, which is probably one of the most. Rome is full of beautiful and interesting and fascinating and curious things. And to me, the elephant in the obelisk is maybe the most curious and fascinating thing in Rome.
It looks like a sort of caricature elephant. Would he have actually seen an elephant?
Yes, he would have seen an elephant because elephants visited Rome occasionally, where they were exhibited to the public for a price, and they were sort of tourist attraction. And there were famous elephants. One elephant was given to Pope Leo X, and he became a great celebrity. Sadly, he died after about 2 years. He was given a rather large amount of solid gold as a laxative, and we don't think it helped him very much. But then in the 17th century, elephants visited Rome. A lot of the great artists, I mean, for example, Rembrandt did some fabulous elephant portraits based on an elephant that visited Amsterdam. So elephants toured Europe. Bernini definitely saw elephants, but the elephant that he carved for the Piazza of Santa Maria sopra Minerva is very much a caricature because it has naturalistic elements, but it also has a hint, just a hint, of a portrait of Alexander VII. And it's quite a funny elephant. It's a very humanized elephant. Not surprising because Bernini invented the art of caricature.
Right.
So, in a way, this elephant, looks a little bit like Alexander.
When he was creating the monument, he didn't get on with the Dominicans who run the church. And you suggest there's a hint in the statue of what he thinks of the Dominican friars.
Yeah, he didn't like, one of the monastery was a Dominican monastery. Bernini was very close to the Jesuits. His best friends in the church were all Jesuits. He was very close to them. And his kind of intellectual go-to person was a Jesuit. Now, unfortunately, one of the Dominican monks thought that he could do a better job of designing the monument than Bernini could. And he, in fact, presented some designs to the Pope, which Bernini was incensed by. So when he eventually got round to creating the elephant, he's got the elephant's bottom facing the Dominican monastery, and the elephant is on the verge of defecating, which is the sort of word you only use at literary festivals. But you understand.
See what I think of you. Yes.
Exactly.
You talked about
you terrible Dominicans.
You talked about the Jesuits, but one of the great characters that come up in the book is Father Kircher.
Yes.
German Jesuit.
Yes, a German Jesuit.
Polymath.
Athanasius Kircher was this astonishing figure who has often been described as the last man who knew everything. I mean, he was an expert. He spanned the whole field of human knowledge, and people were hugely impressed by him. He was amazingly productive. I mean, he churned out these huge books at a sort of amazing speed. Most of them were total nonsense. And one has a feeling, I mean, either Kircher, and he is a very controversial character, either he was a total fraud, or he just really wanted to be nice to people. So when anyone came to him and said, look, could you tell us how to translate the hieroglyphs? He couldn't bear to say no. You know, he loved to say yes to everything. So he was able to explain the hieroglyphs, astronomy, geology. I mean, anything you asked, Kircher could explain. None of it's really held water subsequently, but he's a very engaging character. I'm very fond of Kircher.
When you were journeying through the research and writing the book, what are the things that you really want to hold on to?
What I want to hold on to is the sense of discovery, the sense of excitement, learning. I love learning, and I had never, because I'd only previously worked mostly on the 18th century. So the 17th century, especially 17th century Italy, was quite a new thing for me. So I had to learn all sorts of stuff. I want to hold on to that thrill of learning, and the thrill of it's the thrill of learning and discovery, and just wanting to know, curiosity. I have a great sense of curiosity, and I'm always trying to find the answer to things. I think it's also very important to realize that you usually don't find the answer, but gosh, it's great fun to look for it, isn't it?
I loved reading the book. It's made me excited about wanting to go back to Rome and discover. It's made me see Rome in a completely different way. I want to discover more things and take the book with me. And also it's made me reflect very much on where we are now in terms of, we were talking about the built environment and the spaces. So it's a book that's been very inspirational to me, and I thank you for it.
Well, I'm very pleased about that, and I thank you.
And thank you for coming to the Chiswick Book Festival.
Thank you.